our plan is both Tarrah and I have created a 10-minute short presentation we're going to share with you in a video format, and then we're going to come back and have a conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and my video, and then Tarrah will go after me. So I got a lot of screens to share here, so let's see. Okay.
Hello, this is Rafael Soldi. I will be sharing today my project titled Imagined Futures or Futuros Imaginarios, which consists of 50 small gelatin silver prints. The project was published as my first monograph by Candor Arts, and today I will be reading the introduction that I wrote for the book, followed by some notes on my process. I stem from a family of immigrants, and my identity has always felt transient, as if built from a collective memory. I was aware of my queerness in an abstract sense from an early age, and this difference added another layer that I never felt empowered to assert. As is often for queer people, I felt my identity existed in a slightly different dimension than everyone else's. Growing up in Peru, I knew that whatever society expected of me as a man, I was destined to disappoint. I imagined my future often, but every version of my future self felt like a fraud. There were no lives around me that mirrored who I am today. No artists, no queer people, no soft men. What I now know to be a gift, a rich and complicated identity, was to me then a confusing and splintered identity. The culture at my all-boys Catholic school was toxic. The display of masculinity was essential to surviving our teens. I was neither interested nor adept at this attitudinizing, and was often labeled a maricón, a complex pejorative synonymous with coward and fag. It was so ingrained in the culture that even friends and family used the word frequently. My identity had been shaped by the heteronormative, patriarchal culture around me, rather than the beautiful ecosystem that was my queer, global selfhood. At age 15, my family relocated to the United States for my father's job. At the end of his post, 2 years later, they returned to Peru. It was my mother who suggested I stay in the United States, knowing that I stood a better chance of success and happiness here. I resented my place of birth for nearly 15 years. But as I entered my 30s, I began to soften and feel a certain nostalgia toward my home, like a longing for a long-lost friend. In many ways, my childhood feels like a dream now, and I find myself wondering if it actually happened. Am I really from that place? How can it feel so foreign today? As of 2021, I have spent more than half my life in the United States. The space between myself and my home, my childhood, is hardening like a callus. I, on the other hand, feel more tender toward the place that once held me. It's my home after all, and maybe together we can reach an understanding. The fictitious futures I once imagined have begun to feel like strangers taking refuge within myself. Migrating to another country did not allow me to escape these visions. It simply buried them. I understand now that what I felt all of those years was not resentment, but grief. In conversation with other immigrants, I noticed the common theme of psychological and emotional displacement, a complicated longing for a home that no longer exists. We often carry a library of unrealized lives that weigh heavily on our psyches. The work in this book is an attempt to mourn the imagined futures I've been carrying with me, just as I would mourn the end of someone's life. All around the world, over the course of 2 years, I utilized the photo booth as a stage for performative ritual and a witness to a farewell. Like the Catholic confessionals of my youth, the photo booth became a space to record this private sacrament. As each imagined future drifted to the surface unannounced, I found an empty cabin in which to close my eyes, acknowledge its presence, thank it, and give it permission to leave. Some have literally left. Recently, while in transit from an exhibition, 20 of the 50 portraits were stolen. My heart sunk when I heard that a few of them were found on a sidewalk in Philadelphia. 14 were never found, and I faced the reality of their departure now in a material way. I think of each one now, roaming the world on its own, searching for the life it was meant to have. This concludes the reading of the introduction to the book, and now a few notes on process for this particular body of work. I am not interested in the photo booth as, from a pop culture perspective, nor the zeitgeist that it conjures, though you could say that its long history with vernacular performance is quite relevant here. The photo booth reminds me of a Catholic confessional akin to the ones I knew in my youth, which always made me uncomfortable. The photo booth is also a very public and very private space at the same time, a small stage for a monumental performance. Every time I step into one of these picture-making chambers, it makes a photograph of me mourning in its belly, a very poetic action for a machine. The booth, in its autonomous nature, thus becomes a collaborator, both witness and complicit in each performance. It also creates a unique image of a unique moment. There are no negatives, no duplicates, simply a one-of-a-kind record of a single moment in time. There are many decisions that the booth makes on your behalf, which is both unpredictable and liberating. For starters, there's a set format. Each booth makes 4 images of a set scale. The format is pretty much standard across the globe. This allowed me to make the work while I traveled over the course of 2 years, as well as keeping this sense of repetition and uniformity that I was seeking. A photo booth also does not need to be operated. It is independent, so I can focus on the internal elements of the process, the imagining, the grieving, the inner gazing, while it makes a record of that moment. I chose to only work with black and white analog photo booths. This was simply an aesthetic choice that spoke to how I envisioned the final piece, and also consistent with the aesthetics of my practice. Conceptual and aesthetic parameters were helpful in the pursuit of a subject that is somewhat abstract. It's important to me that these are not simply, quote, photo booth selfies. It just turned out to be a very practical and conceptually sound vehicle for picture making in this case. The images are passport-sized, and booths were originally conceived for the purpose of creating photo IDs, which were used to catalog society. While the passport quality lends an air of travel, of transience, of impermanence, it is also a powerful form of control and surveillance, all of which are elements of the immigration process. Historically, queer bodies have been documented, surveilled, and cataloged as deviant, sick, or odd, often subjected to internment, violence, or death. These images, in their formal elements and in my performative choices, borrow from an aesthetic of criminality and even death portraits, squarely putting a queer body into that context. Today, as we move into an era of facial recognition, personal data sharing, and the criminalization of asylum, it is important to understand that certain bodies occupy a different space in the state surveillance apparatus. We're even learning of how racial bias in technological developments influences state control mechanisms that disproportionately target people of color. It is this body of work that has fueled my more recent projects that investigate the construction of gender and the theater of masculinity in Latin America, and the building of mutated identities in post-colonial Peru.
Okay, and I'll pass it over to you, Tarrah.
Hi, my name is Tarrah Krajnak. Thank you to Rafael for inviting me to join him tonight and to the PPAC for hosting. One of Jorge Luis Borges' best-known short fictions is a multi-layered, time-bending story called El Jardín de Senderos que se bifurcan, or The Garden of Forking Paths. And this is the title that I borrowed from my own photo book. After 8 years in the making, my book is in the final proofing stages. I'm so grateful to my publisher, Deus Books. I also want to acknowledge the Center for Documentary Studies for awarding this project the 2020 Dorothea Lange Paul Taylor Prize. My book begins with an inversion. My hand is seen in both the positive and negative form, holding two seemingly identical photographs, and with a short epigraph by Borges, who writes of a web of time, the strands of which approach one another, bifurcate, intersect, or ignore each other through the centuries, that embraces every possibility. He continues, "We do not exist in most of them. In some, you exist and not I, while in others, I do and you do not. In this one, you have come to my gate. In another, you, crossing the garden, have found me dead. In yet another, I say these very same words, but am an error, a phantom." And in many ways, my book is an exercise in spectropoetics, moving between parallel times. My own voice and those of invented ancestors, imaginary mothers, mistranslated memories, dream lives, and false origins to form a kind of psychic history. The book examines my relationship as an orphan and as a transracial adoptee to the social and political context of Lima, Peru, circa 1979, my birth year. One of the last poems that I wrote for the book is this dream parable called After the Mothers Stopped Looking. It is now the foreword. Readers first encounter this black blank page indicating a shift into a different time space. After the mothers stopped looking. The mothers were flat now like wrinkled paper, and they wore identical gowns on the day they decided to stop looking. Meanwhile, the children, who hid in the tall trees, had grown new tongues. Their hair was white, and they had weeping sores on their eyes and in their mouths. They slept with the dogs, and the dogs ate the rats that ate the poison that the fathers had placed in the traps. The dogs licked the sap from the children's sores, and the children learned to lick the sap from the dogs' sores too. After the mothers stopped looking, the fathers too forgot how to count. The days were years, years were hours, weeks were decades, decades were minutes, minutes were days, were seconds. After the mothers stopped looking, the days were always nights. The blackbird swallowed the sky, and the fathers asked the sky to remember the children. The sky hunted the dogs, and though the children went to great lengths to hide the dogs, they could not stop the sky from swooping in and taking them. The sky then ate the dogs, who ate the rats, who ate the poison that the fathers had placed in the traps. After the mothers stopped looking, the sky was so full that she flooded the valley with poison rains. As the waters rose higher and higher, the sleeping bears drifted from their caves like floating islands. The living pigs gathered dead pigs and built a pig wall. The fathers forgot they were fathers, and the children, no longer children, fell like ladders into the belly of the islands. The dream parable is followed by a series of doubles that I curated from my own photographs. This one, taken with a pinhole camera, is titled Twin Beds, 11 West Phillips Street, Coaldale, Pennsylvania, 1989. They pushed the beds together, my brother to the left and my sister to the right. I was born in the middle. I was born there in that deep crevice between the two beds. Time twin, Claudia, Lima, 1979, Claremont, California, 2017. I went to her house and I asked her to make me into her. I put on her lipstick and I wore her clothes, and then she taught me how to sit like her, cross-legged on the floor. Then she photographed me as her. Birth Defects, the Museum of Birth Defects, Cusco, 2011. The baby goats' conjoined faces looked in opposite directions, but I did not ask what they saw. Both faces were eyeless, with lips sewn shut. The photograph you see here has a halftone dot pattern because it was appropriated from a 1979 political magazine that I collected in Lima. Rephotographed and Xeroxed, then rephotographed again. These appropriated photographs appear throughout the book and depict sites where violence against women occurred that year. Throughout the book, I use photographic process, things like focus and image quality, as a way to convey a multi-layered experience of narrative time, locational shifts, flashbacks, and flash-forwards. The text reads, "She arrived in Lima, and the winter fogs were already starting in. The garua that softens the sky for months in a donkey-gray cloud, sunless and still, tempered by occasional drizzles that never quite reach the ground. The tearlessness of her skies," wrote Herman Melville, "and cold wind. She could have lived 1,000 different lives here," she thinks. Melville himself encountered Peru in the mid-19th century after an earthquake, and he described Lima as the, quote, "saddest, strangest city." He was disgusted at the barbarism at the heart of urban civilization, and he had a hatred for the European conquest of Peru and its imposed architecture. I was interested here in Peru as a modern imaginary, and I was struck by the modern literary topos, which suggests that Peru is the opposite side of the world, an exotic place, a place where characters might go to escape or hide from social shame, a place of exile, quote, "darkest Peru," Peru as, quote, "disappearance," and the word disappear carrying so much historical weight in the Latin American context. One of the central themes of the book is the nature of historical trauma itself. Here, I am using projection, performance, and rephotography to imaginatively return my body to these violent sites that represent a much larger social history that I inherited, but did not necessarily experience firsthand. I have used this technique throughout this work, but also in larger performance-based installations. The titles, dates, and locations are important, and they refer to the collapsing of past and present. Self-Portrait as Walking Woman, Lima, 1979, Claremont, California, 2018. In a critical essay entitled "Inventions of the Real," art historian Xavier Moon writes, "Krajnak's works, I would argue, do not attempt a project of, quote, understanding, but one of retrieval, reenactment, and empathetic connection, a, quote, making visible of objects and bodies previously submerged from view and once again represented in the company of self-fashioned kin, navigating the disruptions and gaps of the historical circumstances into which she was born. Krajnak in her Lima, Peru, circa 1979 works, inventively presents new constellations of being and belonging." And I want to add here that this way of thinking through collective history or historical trauma or post-memory necessarily situates identity as an ongoing process of becoming. Another poem and series of photographs that appears near the end of the book, entitled "Elegy of Milk," also alludes to ideas of intergenerational trauma. This is the last poem I will read, but before I do, I'll move through the photographs that lead up to the poem. Elegy of Milk. Many say that milk is mild, but to me, milk is violent, and I call it so. Milk of violence. I will it to be. A mother could, via blood, in utero, or via breast milk, transmit this dis-ease to her baby. Some of you may recognize the poem's first stanza, which I borrow from Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida, replacing the word sugar with milk. Barthes writes to compare the violence hidden within the photograph to the hidden violence involved with the historical production of sugar. My last stanza, however, relates to an image drawn from Andean folklore called La Teta Asustada, which literally translates to the frightened teat. I found this in the research of anthropologist Kimberly Tidon, whose interviews with survivors of sexual violence in the Central Andes reveals a widespread belief in the power of mother's milk to transmit prenatal trauma to an infant, according to one account. One day, some other woman told me, if you leave your baby in the mountain, the Apu, mountain god, would grab her and she would die. Remembering this, I left her on a mountain so she would die. How was she going to live like this? I had passed on all my suffering through my blood, through my breast. Everything passed through my milk, my blood, my worries. This indigenous belief clearly articulates the concept of epigenetic memory, where trauma could in fact be passed down at the molecular level through generations. And yet, in large part, these indigenous women's survival stories have gone entirely missing from the official archives of the war, their bodies invisible as they are continually erased each time the war is recounted and retold. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tarrah. So I think we're going to move to a conversation. I wanted to take a minute again to thank PPAC. Introduce myself again. I'm Rafael Soldi. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm speaking to you from Seattle, which is the ancestral land of the Duwamish people. And I think we wanted to begin our conversation today, and we have some images to share along the way as well. But I think we wanted to start with the facts, with talking about our identities and how our identities may align or not align with one another's in relation to our relationship to a country like Peru. I was born in Peru. I spent the first half of my life there, and I later had the choice to move to a different country. So that was a choice that I got to make. And then I wanted to, a few weeks ago, I shared an essay with Tarrah that really got me thinking about how we talk about the body in photography, because I think we often use that term. And I think this is an important part of the conversation we're having today. This is an essay. I'm old school, so I have it here in paper. This is an essay by trans artist and writer Gordon Hall, and it's called Why I Don't Talk About the Body, a Polemic. And I just have a couple of lines highlighted that I want to read that will kind of bring us to the beginning of our conversation. But they say, speaking about the body is a way of referencing bodies that do not belong to anyone in particular, but that have ceased to be multiple. The term the body disregards the full range of bodily differences in favor of prioritizing typicality, standardization, and predictability. But talking about bodies instead of the body is more than a semantic difference. A body we haven't specified is not the same as a body in general. Bodies, plural, means something distinct from the body. An implied multiplicity is very different than the substitution of a monolith. And in this case, I think we're thinking about Latinx identity as a monolith. Finally, they write, there is no part of this argument that favors particular kinds of artistic work above others, figurative, abstract, body-based, performance, and so on. Instead, I am critical of the framing devices that surround artist work, how what we do gets described, presented, contextualized, and circulated. So just kind of in keeping that, keeping with that idea of the specificity of bodies and how important they are in talking about art, we wanted to note that Tarrah and I look very different. I am a third generation Peruvian from a family of European immigrants. I have spent my entire life there. But the differences in our identities actually carry a very heavy weight in a deeply racist and classist country like Peru, which is a product of colonial intervention. So I'll pass it over to Tarrah to address this a little bit.
Well, I have to say, I just want to first acknowledge that it's really difficult for me to talk about these subjects in a public forum like this. I want to acknowledge that it's a very contentious moment in our country to be talking about identity, and it's vulnerable. It feels very vulnerable for me. So I just want to put that out there. I've been preparing to talk about this in public since you contacted me about speaking together. But I want to bring up one of the things that I said in my presentation, which is that I think of identity as an ongoing process of becoming, something that's unfinished. And I've quoted Stuart Hall many times to my students in relationship to this idea of identity as unfixed, but also identity emerging as an unfinished conversation formed at the unstable point where personal lives meet the narrative of history. And so I do think of my own identity in this way, as very unfixed and hard to, when people ask me, what are you? It's a really difficult, where are you from? Like, it's a really difficult question for me to answer. That said, I'm going to try to do the best I can to kind of frame my identity for this conversation. And I would say that I'm a transracial, transnational adoptee, and that is the first way that I would describe my experience in this country. And I think that few figures have really crossed as many borders and kind of boundary lines as a transnational, transracial adoptee, because particularly, I think in the early days of international adoption, I was born in 1979, so it was very much on the early end of transnational adoption, that children were passing between countries, families, cultures, classes, races, and histories, and total assimilation was the goal. There was really, it was an unquestioned goal, this idea of color blindness in relationship to adoption. And, there were a lot of, there's a history in the United States and both in Latin America of indigenous children being adopted by white parents. And this is a long history that it's too long to get into here in this conversation, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that I'm part of this history that is a very complex history having to do with what does it mean to be transracial? What does it mean to be a person of color but raised in a family with white parents? That's a very particular experience. So I was born in Peru, and I was born in a Catholic orphanage run by German missionary nuns. And there's a whole story there. I mean, German nuns in Peru it's just really interesting to me. My parents are second generation Czech American. They're from a small coal mining town in Pennsylvania, which I find really interesting because other adoptees I meet, don't come from the kind of working class background that I come from. But my grandparents both worked in the mines from the time they were 6 years old until they died of black lung when they were 65, when they finally retired. And then my parents adopted my sister at the same time they adopted me. She was 3 years old from Abancay, which is a totally different region of Peru, and also a different, she's Andean, I'm not Andean, so we were, I didn't actually understand these things until I went to Peru and started thinking about the kind of complex racial history that is Peru. And then they brought us back to the US, and then 3 months later, they adopted my brother, who is African-American from Philadelphia. And then they raised my brother and I as twins in our early years. So that adds another layer of complexity there. We grew up mostly in all white suburban communities outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And again, like Cleveland is a really strange place as well. There was just a story about Slavic Village, which is 90% Black, which is literally 20 minutes from where I grew up, but my brother and one other Black person existed in my high school. So it was, this is, I would say, really important to understanding like what my relationship was to Peru, because when I went back to Peru, when I returned to Peru, I was 30 years old. And it blew up my identity. I mean, my already unstable identity was sort of blown up. And I started to make work about like what it was to go back and feel this kind of like intensified parallel or double consciousness where I suddenly looked like people recognized me, people had an idea about where I was from. And, you know, it was just, that became the book. So the starting point of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, the title of our talk is Tracing Peruvian Imaginaries, and this is
Yes.
something that we have talked about so much because we both work with imagination in addressing our identity and our relationship
Mm-hmm.
to the same place, yet I think we come at it from very different perspectives. In some way, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, because I think me having spent an actual life there, I tend to sort of imagine the futures that didn't happen because I left, and you're using kind of imagination to address, you know, a life that never played out there because you left as a baby, and there's such an interesting parallel there. Can you talk a little bit about how you use imagination in your work?
Sure. I mean, I think we had.
And I'll pull up those two images.
Yeah, I think we
Tarrah.
had two images that I thought were just so incredibly similar when I started looking at your project and then started looking at my work to try to pull kind of similar threads, right? But also, I think so these photographs, I want to start with these photographs because I think we're both using aesthetic qualities of the death portrait, or I would say mourning portraits. And those were very prevalent in the 19th century. And the black and white also is something that I see as important to both of our projects here. I think, you know, where my work in terms of imagination, you know, I think that I'm dealing with marginalized histories of Peru. I'm trying to find out, you know, one of the major questions that I posed to myself when I went back to Peru is I started thinking about like why, you know, 1979 was like this year of orphans, and I wanted to understand what led to the displacement of all of these children, like what led to these orphans. And so in terms of what that meant for me as a researcher, because I think the project is very much research based, and I was collecting all of these like archives. And when I talk about an archive, I was really interested in vernacular photographs and found photographs. And, you know, because there really is no official archive of women's stories related to, you know, I was really interested in rape as a mass weapon of war and the iconography of rape. And to try to research that is very difficult because those stories are left out of the archives. So in terms of like how I'm using imagination in ways where I have to kind of listen to the silences in the archive. I have to listen to the gaps. And I think like one writer that was really influential to me is Saidiya Hartman. And I think like her way of engaging with listening to the silence in the archive gave me the tools, right, to think about how I could do that in a photographic sense. So when this particular image, these two images come between two very difficult sequences in the book, the Elegy of Milk poem, but also the sequence on Sarita Colonia, which I don't really have time to get into Sarita's story, but I think that you know, if you look at the image on the left, it's a found photograph. And I found that photograph, I think in 2011. I found it in a trash bin in the center of Lima, and it haunted me. A lot of the photographs that are found in my book haunted me for years. And the way that I dealt with that haunting was to rephotograph it. I would bring it out and then rephotograph it, and then bring it out and rephotograph it. And I kind of didn't understand how to work with these images because, you know, I wasn't sure, is this a medical portrait? It's a very haunting photograph. I'm like, what is this? Like, is she dead? Is she having surgery? Is this a medical photograph? Like, I didn't understand what this photograph was. And so through the process of rephotographing it, though, I came to associate it with these missing stories, these kinds of unknown or unknowable things about Peru that I was trying to get to but couldn't get to. And then I really placed those two images in between the Sarita and Elegy of Milk poem because I wanted then to think about what was my role in, as a photographer, it was my responsibility as an artist to dealing with this history. Like, how do we care for this history as well? Like, how do we bring these narratives forward without appropriating them, without, as Azulay says, like repeating the violence of the archive, right? So I put a bandage over my eye, and I called that image like, oh, I'm taking a self-portrait as the photograph, like to make this almost empathetic connection to the photograph. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there because I could go on and on, Rafael, but I'm going to stop there.
Let's see, am I muted? No, I'm not. Okay. Great. Yeah. I mean, I feel like we've talked a lot about repetition and rephotographing, and, you know, I feel like that's something that is, appears in both our works. I have images here. I realize you haven't seen the order I placed the images in. So if you want to reference something specifically, let me know. You know, today I was thinking about Imaginaries today, and my friend Jess brought up a quote from the book, from my book, that Miguel Lopez, who's the writer who wrote the essay for my book, wrote. And the quote says, "By constructing an archive of photographs of his own motionless body, Soldi not only expresses his own personal grief, he also describes a shared mourning for all that we are often forced to leave behind: a land, a family, a language, in order to keep living." And
yeah,
I was thinking, you know, you were mentioning in our conversation these last few days, talking about activating memory, and
right.
you know, yeah.
Right, because I think that like your work, to me, yes, you can associate it with grieving and loss and mourning, but there's a way in which it's also an act of, I would say, radical hope, because I think of imagination as a form of radical hope, right? So what you're doing in your work, I think, is really powerful, because especially when it's extended. I mean, I know we haven't shown this yet in the slideshow, but when I saw you working with communities to almost perform the same acts that you were performing in the photo booth, I thought, wow, this work is really powerful. Because in my work, I would say, like, I never think of the work as passive. I think of it as active, as activating memory. And I always use the words, like, I'm always careful to use the words build, invent, recover, because it's not passive. It's not sad work. It's doing work. It's activating memory. It's trying to build a history from that silence. And so I think of your work doing similar work. I think of your project as being actually very active and not passive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people sometimes will come up to me and say, you know, oh, this work is sad or it's dark, and it's funny because I don't think of it as sad or dark. I think that
Yeah,
you can take things that have been struggles or even just difficult to deal with. You know, in my case, I'm extremely lucky. I had I have a loving, wonderful family that's given me everything that I needed. So it wasn't that I had a bad childhood. Like, that's not really what this work is about. It's just, it was about understanding what it means to grow up as a queer kid in a place like Peru, and how you can take that experience and make something from it, as Miguel says, in order to keep living. And
Yes.
when I finished that body of work, it felt unfinished. You know, like, I felt like I was using my own personal experience. It's funny because I'm actually not super comfortable being photographed, yet the work is 50 pictures of my own face. And someone mentioned recently something about me making self-portraits, and I was like, have I made self-portraits? Like, I was trying to remember, like, what work are they referring to where I've made self-portraits? And I was like, oh, that, you know, because I don't think of it as me going out there to make a picture of my face. I was thinking of it as this ritual, this tool to address a certain topic. And then, as you said, so what we have on the screen was I decided that I needed to share that I had found a way to help me understand a part of my history, and I wanted to see if it might help other people as well. So we gathered through a local organization here in Seattle that works with queer men around issues of HIV, but not exclusively. We made a call and we gathered a group of 10 male identifying Latinx people who joined us for a private evening of conversation and meditation. And I, alongside a facilitator, kind of led them through a series of questions about how they pictured their own futures as children in their countries, how they picture them now, how has that changed or not. And then it was a pretty emotional evening. It lasted about 2 hours. And then at the end, I had built a booth. I wanted it to look different from my work. I didn't want it to be like black and white, you know, photo booths. So I built this color booth, and I invited them. They all kind of left the room, and then one by one, they each came into the booth with me. And I had them close their eyes, and I led them through a meditation, a series of questions that they answered for themselves. And I told them that at any point during that time, they were holding the cable release, they could press the shutter and make a portrait of themselves. And that's what you're looking at here. And it was a really powerful and transformative experience for sure.
I mean, it's conveyed through the portrait, I think. They feel very powerful. And there's something about what we can't know. Again, like this, the unknowable that is the eyes closed, the public, the private. There's something really beautiful about that, Rafael. And I love the way that the project has extended into performance and social practice.
Yeah, thank you. Let's I'd love to talk about photography and our not to pivot, but we only have so much time.
And then we should open it up to questions pretty soon. So
yeah, so I'm gonna go here actually, maybe, because I think we both have a very specific relationship to photography, and
yes,
I'm happy to show whatever image you want. But I know that we both work with photography in either experimental ways or in sort of non-traditional ways. And there's also, you have a long history with poetry. I've been making some new, I've been calling them text works, but then you call them poetry, which was...
they're poetry, but Rafael, they're poetry.
That was a fun conversation. So I don't know. What do you think? What do you have to say about photography?
Well, I think, you know, I have a very mixed relationship. I have a, you know, photography, I love photography, but I'm always questioning my relationship to photography, I think, because I'm an educator as well. You know, I've been teaching now, I think, for 18 years, teaching photography. And I think the history of the medium is really important to me. It's important that my students are engaged with the theories and history and also making photographs, right? Because I think like that's where I have a kind of contentious relationship with photography, is that it's so easy to consume. Like everyone here made a photograph today, right? I mean, it's just like everyone makes photographs, distributes photographs, consumes photographs. And in a way, there is a kind of invisibility about the medium that I think it's true. It can just be this invisible medium in a way where we're seeing through this window to whatever the photograph represents. But I take very seriously writers like Azulay, who calls for a new ethics around photography. And she argues for a kind of photography that calls us to be citizens. And I think that what that means is this idea that we must be responsible for the photographs of suffering that we are seeing on an everyday basis. And we must ask ourselves, what conditions do we create that allow like this to happen? And that this is why, you know, what is heavily weighing on my mind right now as we speak is just these videos that are going around of the Capitol riots, and, you know, just like thinking about this talk and like the heavy, like there's a lot of heavy things in my book that actually I just watching it now, I was just like, oh my God, like there's a lot of pain in that book. But you know, what is going on right now is also really painful and difficult, and it's just out there on these social media platforms. And so like when I say I'm always thinking about my relationship as a photographer, I'm referring to the ethics of what it means to take a photograph, to consume a photograph, to distribute a photograph. And I'm constantly kind of renegotiating that, because photography is changing a lot. It changes a lot, right? And my students, the generations change, their relationship with photography changes. And anyway, so those questions weigh heavily on my mind, especially now. Like I feel wiped out, honestly, from like what, and I think other people are feeling the same, just like what's going on in our country, you know, so.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I mean, I think I've always had, I was trained, I would say, or educated in a very kind of traditional, you know, photography background. And lately I wouldn't say that I've fallen out of love with photography, but I've been doing some heavy flirting with other mediums. And it's been really liberating, you know, to find other voices and other ways to engage with photography and with other mediums. This work, for example, that I'm not really talking about at length today, but these are, and I included these because I think there's some parallels too in how
Yes.
we work with rephotographing and kind of taking apart the photographic medium. But these are videos that I found online that were posted by Peruvian teens performing these playground kind of brawling, bullying rituals called cargamonton. And I'm trying to create these images that have this aesthetic of surveillance that put you in this very uncomfortable place between torture and pleasure. And they are, you know, I've photographed the screen, printed those out, rephotographed them, and now they're being printed as photogravures. So there's a multiple kind of layering of process that happens. I know you've used halftone, you've used projection, you've used repetition. So I think we tend to kind of like playing with photography in that way, in similar ways. And then I wanted to share like a funny little anecdote about this because when I sent, these are some text pieces I've been working on that are new. Poetry, new poems, thinking a lot about language and about having kind of my life from now moving forward being more and more American and less, well, maybe not more American, less Peruvian, but I would say having lived more time here and less time there, and feeling a real kind of slight loss of language over time. And I had sent Tarrah my presentation a few days ago, and she asked me about the word maricón, which I brought up in the presentation. And she said, I thought you were saying American, not maricón. And I was like, oh, that's funny, because I have a piece that I had made that was putting the word American and a maricón together, because they're spelled almost the same. They sound almost the same, but one means American and one means a fag or a faggot. So I thought that was an interesting conversation.
Yeah, my Spanish ear is horrible. And so I often I misinterpret things all the time. But I loved that misinterpretation, actually. I loved the way that I misunderstood that word. And then that you had already made a piece about it, I thought was really incredible.
Yeah, me too. Before we open to questions, do we want to talk at all about our books? I know we both have books that just
my book is not out yet. It's in print right now. It's going to print. It's proofing, so it'll be out very shortly. I'm really excited about it. It's been 8 years. It's taken me 8 years to make this book. So
and this is an early maquette.
That's an early dummy. Yeah, an early dummy. So it will look totally different from that. But those are the images that I have right now. Yeah, so, but I just wanted to shout out to Sean Bush and Deus Books and all of the people and you know who you are, people here who helped me with my writing and my editing and just being really supportive. I think it's also, I think, a debut of my writing, which is really, I don't know, it feels weird. it feels good, but it also feels like I'm exposed in some new way because it's also my writing, which is newer for me than photography. So, but I'm excited about it and I'm ready to publish it. So yeah, it'll be out soon, Deus Books, and it'll be available through my, I don't even know how we're doing that, but probably just on my website.
I'm very excited for it as well. And then I want to shout out also Candor Arts, and I saw Matt here earlier.
Beautiful book.
Have just done a beautiful job with the book. And if you haven't gotten your copy yet, I'm sure you'll get it soon. Every single element of the book you see here has been made by hand. And that's just so lovely to collaborate with a team that is willing to put their hands on every inch of your project.
Attention to detail.
Absolutely. So
materiality.
I'm so happy. So, all right, maybe I'll go back here and we can take some questions. So maybe I'll stop sharing for now and we can take some questions, if there are any.
I see in the chat. Are there questions?
I see a comment from Stephanie who said,
"Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for the comments. These are beautiful comments. Thank you."
Yeah, it says, your stories and work are very meaningful to me as a sister mourning the loss of our relationship with my brother, adopted from Korea in 1976. I have recently started to research the experience of hundreds of children/orphans from Korea, adopted across the world. Deep appreciation for all you're willing to share and expose to us.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
That's lovely. Thank you, Holly. Yeah, and we're willing to take any questions. Also, if you just want to speak, that's great also.
We love hearing voices.
Feel free to unmute yourself. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Diana. Tarrah, when's the last time you were in Lima or in Peru?
Oh my gosh. I was my junior sabbatical. So let's see, 2017?
Mm-hmm.
2017, I went to the Amazon for the first time. And I photographed ruins in Tarapoto. Was in Tarapoto. Oh, I went to go see the pyramids, which is,
And
there's a little Awaka, the Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Sun. And there's a surprise book in my book. There's a little book in the big book, and it features these pyramids. So
I love that surprise book. And that wasn't your first time there, though. You had been once or twice before, right?
To Peru?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've made multiple trips. I mean, the book took multiple research trips, and then hopefully I'll be able to go back, because the second phase of the project is actually, I want to go back, and we were talking about this. I'm really interested in Catholic missionaries and the role of the missionaries in, you know, my adoption one, but also in looted objects from indigenous cultures and the ways that they've traveled around the world through these missionaries. So that's kind of like a long way off, but that's kind of what I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in the stories of the other adoptees. And many of them ended up being raised in Germany with the families of the German nuns. And so I want to go to Germany and find these other indigenous Peruvians who grew up in Germany.
I'm excited to see what happens there. There's a question, they say, how did you two meet and what was your first connection? I had heard of Tarrah's work before and I couldn't remember from whom, but I am one of the people who runs Strange Fire Collective with 3 other folks, and actually with 5 other folks right now. And I decided to, we release an interview every Thursday. We've done that for about 5 years, and I decided that I really wanted to talk to Tarrah and learn more about her work. So I asked her if I could interview her, and that was kind of our introduction. And funny enough, I remember doing the interview via phone, but I happened to be in Peru visiting my family. So calling you via WhatsApp and having this conversation about our experiences with that country while I was visiting there, and you were here, and it was and then since then we've seen each other at SPE and other events and continued a conversation.
Yeah.
Every time it feels like we're just scratching the surface, and
I know. I remember that because people kept telling me about your work. They're like, there's this other Peruvian, Tarrah. You've got to check out this other Peruvian's work. And I'm always kind of scared to meet other Peruvian artists because I'm just like never Peruvian enough, you know. But I loved our conversation and our interview. And I think like just talking to you over these years about, you know, Peruvianness has been actually really good for me, and really allowing me to understand the complexity of Peruvian identity, even for you. And you grew up there. I mean, it is a very complex notion, this idea of Peruvianness. I think there's other oh, Kelly. Hi, Kelly. Could you both speak a little more about inventing narratives and the difficulties of deciding which narratives to feature in the work and which ones to leave on the editing floor or save for another project? Do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, people often ask me if I remember what I was thinking in each one of these portraits. Let me share the screen again, and the answer is no, I don't remember. And I think of while there is an element of inventing narrative in this work in particular, right, where I'm stepping into these booths and I'm using my imagination to imagine the futures that never got lived by me in that country, and then giving them permission to find somebody else to live them, perhaps someone who's a better fit for them. Um, I felt like those, even though it sounds maybe like a very rich, like visual experience in that moment, it actually felt very, um, very fleeting. You know, the visions weren't always like clear. Sometimes they were very vague, very abstract. So it was for me more of a cumulative project, cumulative process or ritual. Um, so it was, I don't know that I ever had kind of an opportunity to choose one narrative and not another, or, you know, but I would say that definitely the invented narratives are far more thin than sometimes people think they are, in the process, if that makes sense. I don't know. What about you, Tarrah?
So could you speak a little more about inventing narratives and the difficulties deciding which narratives to feature? Okay, so I think I was really led by my research and then just thinking about this question of the historical circumstances that led to the displacement of children, and that really became the focus of this book. But I had two other book dummies before I came to this one. And ultimately I just scrapped them. You know, it took me years to make them, and then I just put them aside, and, you know, they're under my studio table somewhere, because they weren't telling the story that I wanted them to tell. Because when you make a book dummy and you take it and you show it to friends, to colleagues, or to portfolio reviews, the main question would just be like, what is holding this work together? Why am I looking at these images? And I would think it was so clear, and they would just be really confused. And so it really pointed me in the direction of, oh, this needs like an opening essay, it needs text. And ultimately that led me to hire a person to write an introductory essay for my work. And for a long time, I think it just wasn't working, you know, it just wasn't working. And I realized that it needed to be in my voice, that I needed to be the one to write the story, that it needed to come from my perspective. And I think like, I really love writer. I mean, I don't even know if people know like who Janet Malcolm is anymore, but I mean, like, I love her writing because there's like these layers that you see how she uncovers a story, or how she, you know, there's like the layers of research that are also part of the work. So in the book, you'll see me holding up like an Azoulay book that says like, have you ever seen a photograph of rape? Because that was the title of one of her chapters in the civil contract. And it was a book that really like stayed with me throughout the making of that work. And you'll see my hand come in and like hold a photograph. And a lot of people were reading those as like my personal family photographs. And it's like, no, like those were found photographs. And so I think of that also as a found narrative. Like you can kind of piece together these women, they kind of look similar. I found a whole stack of, not stack, I mean, I collected them over time, but of passport photos. And when I laid them out on the table, they looked like the same person. It was really strange. And so I wove that narrative like into the book. But there were a lot of, I think, photographs, whole bodies of work that were supposed to be in the book that I just took out because I wanted it to be really tight. And I think like once I got to the dummy version that you see in the slideshow, I think I knew that that was it, you know, and I knew that I just needed some more poems to kind of like hint to the meaning of some of the images. And it just kind of, you know, it took a while though. It took 8 years.
Yeah, we have another question here for you, Tarrah, actually, around how do you build connections while visiting Peru, considering you're not super comfortable with Spanish?
Yeah,
or at
no,
least
that's a really good question. So I felt really, I mean, when you don't know the language, like you're just lost. Like, and I think it was important for me to feel that, you know, like to not be able like everyone was expecting me to speak fluent Spanish, and they would be like, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you speaking to us in Spanish?" And I just felt so stupid. I felt so American in my my one language of English. I felt so ashamed. And for a long time, and I still now have so much shame around not being able to like speak Spanish, and then other people would be like, Tarrah, you grew up like in Ohio, and your parents like it was never like even a question, like, why would I speak Spanish? Because honestly, like when I went to Peru the first time, I studied Spanish in college for literally the whole time. I took Spanish in high school. I studied Spanish for a total of 8 years, and like I can read some Spanish. I know all the food. I can order food.
That's all you need to know.
Yeah, I know. But I just struggled. It's like, how do you communicate with people? Well, I would record my conversations. Like, I think what happened with why it took so long to make this work as well is you'll see these images right here. They're like women. I put out ads on Facebook and in Lima, like with paper ads for women who were born in 1979. And I had a studio in Barranco, and I have a lot of Peruvian friends who went to Ohio Wesleyan, shout out to OWU, who helped me locate other like studio assistants who would help me. But, when those women came to speak to me and tell me their stories and I was recording them, I recorded them, and then I was like, I would bring them out and I'd be like, oh my God, I can't understand. Like, there's talking so fast, like, and I would try to slow it down. And then what eventually happened was I started memorizing their words. I had listened to their recordings, straining to understand that I memorized their stories in my Spanglish. And then I repeated their stories in my bad accent back to like a translation program. And that translation program, many years old now, would spit out like poetry. I was like, oh my God. When I went to poetry classes and I spoke to poets about my struggle and my shame around language acquisition and not being able to work with this material that I had wanted to work with, their suggestion was to work. That's the work. The work is the fact that that you're straining and you have shame, and like this is part of the work. So I think like going to those poetry workshops and working with, these poets on language and thinking about how does the mistranslation and the kind of the bad accent, how is that more true to your experience of Peru than it would be if you waited 8 years to like learn your Spanish and try to do this perfect, like it actually made a lot of sense. Then I was able to kind of to use my relationship to Spanish and also my relationship to these women's stories, and that it's now kind of a melding of my misunderstanding and my mistranslated stories that become these poems in the book.
I love that. I mean, I love the idea of using that translation process to understand something better. I was reading, and I wish I could find where I read that it was an article where a person who is fluent in sign language, and I'm not sure if they were deaf or not, but they were saying that when they want to understand something better, they will take the word or the expression in English and then translate it into sign language and then translate it back to English. And that they would find that it would come out on the other side with a completely different set of words, but that described the thing in a much more meaningful way. And I really loved, something like I'm very upset might end up coming out on the other side as I have an upset heart or something like that, and there was a really beautiful thing where it kind of meant the same, but when you put it through this pasta roller of translation, it would come like another thing,
Yeah.
which is lovely. Okay, we have very little time, so
Yes. Are there any other questions?
I mean, there's one here on how does performance art and photography intersect. We could go on that forever, and I don't know that we have the time, but there's definitely such a long history of performance art and photography intersecting from the very beginning, photography being one of the only ways to document performance art. I think that alone has brought photography and performance together for so long. And for me, and I'm going to say I know it's the same for you, but correct me if I'm wrong, I feel that the work is as much for performance as it is photography.
Yes, I do too. I mean, there's another slide in there way down, but it's these were performed. So the same images from the book, the archival images, I created a whole live performance from them where I brought the darkroom to the gallery, and I stand in just like you see me standing in the archival photographs and rephotographing myself. I just thought it was such a magical, almost spiritual experience to have these archival images so large and in a darkened space, that I wanted other people to be able to experience what that was like. And so I did this as a live performance at a gallery in Los Angeles, and I'm hoping to travel that, because I think it's a very more active way of understanding the work. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. Before we wrap it up, I have a really short anecdote I wanted to share about language, because I saw Mark mention this and you were talking about going back to Peru. Recently, I went home to visit my family and I was in a store, and the woman at the store told me that I spoke very good Spanish, which broke my heart because it means they thought I was a tourist who spoke really good Spanish. And I was like, no, I'm from here. I'm from, I spoke it differently enough that she was able to, that she thought I just spoke very, very good Spanish as a foreigner. And I was like, no. So anyways, someone's saying show more images, please. I'll just go through these and
okay.
Before we log off. We don't have very many, but but thank you to everybody.
Exactly.
I see.
Yes, thank you.
It's a long talk, so I really appreciate all of you who stayed around.
Yeah, it was an amazing talk. So thank you so much for taking the time and effort to be here, both Rafael and Tarrah, and all of you listening to the talk. It's wonderful to see everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yes,
and thank you.
Shout out to my students, my lady friends, my college sweetheart. Yeah, my colleagues. Thank you so much for coming.
And I think even my parents were here. I saw them earlier, which I love. So, yeah.
Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Tarrah.
Yes.
Thank you both, Rafael and Tarrah. Tarrah, quickly, how long was the performance? I'm interested in that performance, real quick.
That performance was 24 hours. Yeah, and then, but I went back to the gallery and made more images. But during the opening, the people could come and watch me making work. Yeah, but it was a month long. Yeah.
Is there any videos on it, or just the stills?
Just stills.
Mm-hmm. This was amazing. Thank you very much. I'm going to have to watch the video because I was kicked off 3 times tonight, which is just very frustrating. But thank you everyone for coming tonight. This was an amazing conversation. You both are incredibly generous, and you're bringing so much love and generosity into the world through your work. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Positive.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Rafael, I just I wanted to let you know that when you were showing all your presentation, that also what came to mind was the idea of leaving a picture with historically, with someone who is beloved. If somebody is going off to war or you know, with my children, I always photograph them sleeping, you know, this idea of the dream state. So I thought that was really beautiful. And Tarrah, I thought that your poem that you read in the beginning is just incredibly haunting and mysterious, and what, you know, there's a narrative and a mystery to it all at the same time.
After the mother stopped looking.
Yeah.
That's the first time I've read that poem out loud, and I was very nervous about it, you know, so I appreciate you saying that.
Oh, you read it beautifully.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I don't know if the process of making that poem was what you just spoke about in terms of the translation, if that came out of that, or if that came from a completely different experience.
Actually, that I was thinking of Patricio Guzman's film about the mothers who roam the Atacama Desert looking for just even a shard of a bone from their disappeared relatives. It was a very moving film that has stayed with me for years, called Nostalgia of the Light. And it just broke my heart, and it stayed with me, and I had dreamt about it. I dreamt about a time when the mothers stopped looking. I dreamt if there was ever a time when those mothers would stop looking. And that was an actual dream I had. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was wonderful, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.